Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Simons, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this Musings lecture. And it's interesting tonight, this is February 2022. We started these Musings in February 2012. So it's exactly the 10th anniversary since Gary Demarest began us 10 years ago. Another first tonight is that we have an amazing tech person, and her name is Debbie Herbert, and she is the CEO of Monte Vista Grove Homes, and she is the tech person behind this. And Debbie has been a great supporter of our musings from the get-go. One thing we did when we started was to produce a book. I want to show it to you. You can see it here. It's Faith and Culture is the name of the book. And it includes the first 6 lectures. We call this Musings at the Juncture of Faith and Culture in the 21st Century. I'm going to read 3 sentences out of this, and then we will introduce our speaker. In the chapters of this book, there's an effort to describe faith as a way of life that sometimes supports current dimensions of culture and sometimes opposes them. Since faith is a personal response to God, there are as many different expressions of faith as there are people. Instead of seeing this as a problem, each of our writers in this book presents the juncture of faith and culture from their personal experience, and we are all enriched by the differences. And I want to say that tonight we will definitely be enriched by the experience of our speaker, who will be introduced by Dean Thompson.
Thank you. Lynn Cheney is a brilliant leader who enables and mentors others in the art of leadership while she is leading them. Her spoken and written words are laced with a poetic eloquence that deeply inspires her listeners and readers. So it is a dear privilege indeed to welcome Lynn as our Musings presenter. Her title is absolutely intriguing: Confessions of a Recovering Racist. Lynn Cheney.
Thank you, Dean. And thank you for all who are present via Zoom. I am honored that you would take time to hear my story when you could well be watching The Bachelor or cleaning your closets this evening. I do hope that there will be something of value in what I share tonight. I titled this Musings, Confessions of a Recovering Racist, styled in part on the 13th
No.
Lynn, we can't hear you.
You're muted.
Can't hear you.
How about now?
You're good.
Shall
Yes. Yeah, it stopped when you said styled on.
Okay, so I'll start there again. Thank you. So somehow I got muted. I have no idea how. My technology is a little challenging sometimes.
Welcome to the club.
I titled this Musings, Confessions of a Recovering Racist, which was styled in part on the 13-volume Confessions of St. Augustine, of which the first 9 of the volumes were autobiographical, reflections on his sinful life and his conversion. Tonight, I have only 40 minutes to share my sinful life and my ongoing conversion when it comes to matters of race and racism, a story that would take at least a full volume to tell. And so tonight will be a very condensed version. Know that in no way do I want to imply that my journey is somehow finished or that I have arrived when it comes to being anti-racist. To the contrary, I am still very much a beginner, and I am struggling to learn new language and new ways of being in the midst of a racist society that I had managed to keep at arm's distance, even when I wasn't aware that I was doing so. I am honored to be part of Black History Month here at the Grove. 3 of this month's convocations being sponsored by our Diversity Task Force with Catherine Hughes and Barbara Matthew at the helm. While I may be wrapping up Black History Month this evening, I really do think that we need a Black History decade or 2 or 3. So much has been left out of the telling of the American story, be it Black, Indigenous people, Hispanic, Asian American, or women's history. The story is incomplete if it is taught from one perspective only, and it is incomplete if it does not include the good, the bad, and the ugly. My hope tonight is not to offer a treatise on, or a theology of, or lessons about racism. Rather, my hope is that my story may call to mind and heart moments in your own stories that might cause deeper reflection and conversation about the gap between the world we are in and the world we are hoping for. And so to that end, I hope that you will please sign up in Marwick for the small group conversations that are being formed over 2 Fridays, March 4th and 18th. We need to share and listen to one another's stories. With that, let me begin mine. Confessions of a Recovering Racist. The late writer David Foster Wallace gave a speech to the 2005 class of Kenyon College graduates. He began, "There are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' The 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, 'What the hell is water?'" Wallace goes on to say that the point of this story is that the most important things tend to be the hardest to see. And I would add that often the most familiar, the most routine things often go unnoticed. I am 66 years old. For a lifetime, my own collusion with and acceptance of a racist society has been hard to see and difficult to notice. We ought to pack them all up and ship them back to Africa.
Here for now. I'll work it out on the big screen.
Okay. Yeah, that's Lynn.
I will assume you all heard that because I didn't like saying it. It was August 1965. The Watts Rebellion in Los Angeles dominated the nightly news, which my father watched religiously. The footage was Armageddon-esque: hurled bricks, fires, looting, anger, shootings. As a child, I was at once horrified and mesmerized, sitting on the floor in front of our small black and white TV. I remember the scene as if it were yesterday. My father stood, his arms crossed, the temple piece of his eyeglasses between his pursed lips. The images flashed across the screen. He said it with disgust, with contempt. They ought to pack them all up and ship them back to Africa. I was 10 years old and barely conscious. Still, something deep in me flared and my heart winced. And that moment has remained etched in my memory ever since. His words sounded so ugly, so hate-filled. And what my father said was, to my mind, wrong. I couldn't have articulated how or why it was wrong, but my soul knew that something was amiss. Perhaps it was as simple as having internalized the stories of Jesus and the songs that I had learned in Sunday school. You could sing it with me. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. If Jesus loved me, wouldn't Jesus love everyone? There was no room in our household for questioning my father. Not only was he the head of the household, he was also our tiny Colorado town's pastor, which meant that in all things he spoke for God. And God was clear that Martin Luther King Jr. was a communist, and that God liked some people more than others. In particular, white men were God's chosen ones. Their lives mattered more than other lives. After all, the disciples were all male and white. Jesus was male and white, at least as depicted in the picture hanging on our living room wall. It follows that Black, brown, beige lives and women's lives didn't matter as much, not to mention LGBTQ lives, but those lives were still in the closet, at least in my bubble. Now, I would like to say that that racist incident in front of the 5 o'clock news awakened my conscience and spurred me to a lifetime of action. The reality was that our tiny little Colorado town was a long way from Los Angeles or from any of the hotspots of 60s racial tension. My entire childhood was lived in isolated rural towns with populations under 1,000. My father was sent to these towns to start churches. The idea being that small town pagans, which included the unchurched, Roman Catholics, and most mainline Protestants, all of them would burn in the fires of hell if someone didn't get them converted. We were fundamentalists. The only point of getting out of bed in the morning was to save souls. Not a glimmer of God's care for the poor and marginalized in our theology. Our only concern was to ensure a heavenly future. Certainly, sin was a big deal, but only the real sins, fornication and divorce, smoking and dancing, movies and alcohol. As well, in the 60s and 70s, in the rural America we lived in, there were no Black or brown people, no known others, except for the lesbian couple that lived a couple of streets away that no one ever acknowledged. Most women were housewives. That was my normal. My education was equally devoid of color. No teachers of color. History classes told white male history, mostly of wars and the conquests of British imperialism and the glory and necessity of the slaughter of indigenous people, supported, of course, by virtually every John Wayne movie ever made. The first Black student that I can recall arrived mid-year during my junior year of high school. I thought he was cute and funny. He thought I was pretty. My mother felt that friendship with the Black men was fine, but that dating would not be wise. He moved a couple of months later, so it was a non-issue. I look back with a sense of dismay and shame that I walked through the 60s and early 70s utterly oblivious to the injustice and cruelties of racism that swirled everywhere but where I lived, which was the middle of nowhere. And it seems a collective unconscious conspiracy was alive, intent on maintaining our rural ignorance. Still, ours was a racist home, not publicly, but racist through and through. My preacher father, while not condoning murder, still felt it a good thing that Martin Luther King Jr. had been silenced, that Bobby Kennedy and his radical ideas about racial equality did not make it out of the Ambassador Hotel. He was certain that Lyndon Johnson and his civil rights movement had pushed us to the brink of communism. That was the water I swam in. Racism was hard to see. Now, I'd like to say that college opened a window to the world, but I cannot. Being a good fundamentalist daughter in search of a good fundamentalist husband, Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois was the obvious choice, Wheaton being the Harvard of the fundamentalist world. There were only a handful of Black students. One, a football player, was part of the group that I hung out with. One night, Andy, which is not his real name, shared with us that he was considering transferring elsewhere. He didn't feel like he fit at Wheaton. There were so few Black students and he'd come from another world, leaving him feeling isolated and alone. I remember being sad and confused, but actually a bit pushy. Rather than explore the gift he was giving and opening the door to his story, we simply negated his feelings. Well, of course you fit. We like you. You're one of us. You can't transfer. Having generalized my own experience, I had no concept of how different life stories can be. I hadn't spent a day outside the worldview of fundamentalism, and I didn't realize how small was the bubble that had been my life. The tide of my understanding began to turn when, having not found my husband at Wheaton, I took a position as director of student ministries at Northwestern College in Orange City, Iowa. There, my ignorance continued, the rural farming community providing a continuation of the narrowness of my life's narrative. We had few Black students in the all-white, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much culture of Northwest Iowa. Still, it was there that I began to discover my passion for ministry and for the church. In fundamentalism, women are not allowed to preach or to pastor. Jesus was male, the apostles were male, the scriptures were clear, women must remain silent in the church. I struggled there to understand why God would give me the desire and gifts for pastoral ministry and then deny access. Didn't make sense, and it seemed cruel and wrong. But how could I make sense of the scriptures that, to me, at that point, were quite clear? So, though female clergy were simply unimaginable, in 1984, 5 years after having arrived in Iowa, I loaded my little silver Toyota Corolla and headed to Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. I needed to sort out my theology and come to terms with the Bible and my own sense of self. Now it is here that I must pause and give my fundamentalist roots some credit. Fundamentalists take the Bible very seriously, though generally quite literally. I knew my Bible well. I loved and respected it, and I still do. What I quickly came to understand in seminary is that I had learned to read the Bible through a particular lens that kept me from really seeing who and what were really there. I began to comprehend Jesus and his mission in new ways. Not that he came to condemn or incite fear of hell, but rather he came to love. His mission, rather than drawing lines between who was in and who was out, was to touch the untouchable, to care for the poor and marginalized. Refusing to build walls between cultures, Jesus didn't seem to care whether you were Samaritan or Jew, sinner or saint, male or female. His agenda was love and radical inclusion. His ways were grace and truth rather than judgment. Jesus cut to the chase in his summary of the commandments, and I took it very personally. I am here to love God with heart, soul, and mind, and to love my neighbor as myself. And by the way, I have no non-neighbors. This new, for me, understanding of Jesus and the text created in me a seismic shift, the beginning of rebirth. Now, as exciting as my liberation was, this was also a very dark chapter as I worked to make sense of the world that I had come from and the world that I was stepping into. The transformation was not easy. It sent me into therapy as I began to understand my own oppression and marginalization as a woman. My therapist was a Black male, a true gift from God, who guided me through my anger at the second-class status that I had internalized over my first 30 years and contend with still to this day. There was a deep connection between us, perhaps because of, in some ways, similar experiences of being marginalized. I spent my seminary years very angry, and I can still flare from time to time. I wasn't pleasant to be around, especially if you were a white male. I was incensed by my male colleague students' largely unexamined status of entitlement and privilege, and the priority their sense of call took over my own. I knew that they would be the first to hear from churches and that my gender would automatically put me out of the running for most pastoral positions. As well, I would need to be twice as good if I were to have a future in the church. Now I must pause here to thank, to thank my beloved husband, Gary Sattler, whose love, support, and encouragement over the years of both ministry joy and challenge allowed me to stay true to my sense of call. I could write a full 9 volumes about my lifetime's worth of experiences of sexism, but that is a different musings. Still, it would be impossible to untangle my journey with racism from my experiences with sexism. It is because of those experiences that the window of my soul finally opened to the injustices perpetrated because of race and sexual orientation. It was a natural and easy step to take, that if oppression and injustice were wrong when aimed at me, they were wrong when they targeted any marginalized person. And the more I worked with the Bible that I love, there I found that that is laid out with crystal clarity over and over and over again. I've come to feel a kindred spirit with the marginalized. Still, by no means do I intend to imply that sexism and racism are equal. As a white woman, while I have borne much, I have borne little relative to my Black and brown neighbors. I was ordained to the ministry of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA on Palm Sunday, 1988. I thank God for Reverend Dr. Dean Thompson, Pasadena Presbyterian Church's head of staff, who took a chance on a female associate pastor before most churches would. Over my 30+ years as a pastor, I have been privileged to serve 4 different churches, 2 as associate pastor, and 2.5 as senior pastor, head of staff. While I was told by individuals at each church that I don't want a lady pastor, I did in the end beat the prevailing church sentiment that my pastor must be a white male. It seems that I knew intuitively how to battle sexism. I needed to show up, work triply hard, and prove to the skeptical that women were just as, if not more, capable than the men. But I had no idea how to battle racism. I once marched in downtown Los Angeles with Rosa Parks and Jesse Jackson. That hardly makes me an activist. I voted my values and spoken up in moments when I could do no other. I've preached it, I've taught it. I've read books, studied Black leaders, written letters to politicians about racial redlining and mass incarceration. I've regularly preached on themes of justice, be it racial or economic, and the love of God for all, no exceptions. But I suffer no illusion that I've nudged the needle even a millimeter toward the just, diverse, equitable world that Jesus intends. And I've still lived my life with all of the white privilege perks that stack the deck against people of color. I'm not ashamed of being white, but I am aware that I have benefited greatly from it. I am by nature a fixer. If something is torn, I try to mend it. If it is broken, I try to repair it. If there's a problem, I try to resolve it. It has taken a long while, but I've ultimately come to terms with the reality that I cannot fix the world for my Black and brown neighbors. I cannot make it safe for my Asian American neighbors. But what I can do is stand with them in imagining and working toward the world we are hoping for, the world God intends. For me, that has meant learning to do what I failed to do with my friend Andy back in my Wheaton College days. There, I simply ignored his story and negated his pain. And now I am learning to listen, even when it makes me uncomfortable or angry, even when it evokes shame or breaks my heart. One of the privileges of being a pastor is being on the receiving end of the sacred stories that comprise each person's personal narrative. I will be forever grateful to the people whose lives have been shaped by generations of discrimination, who nonetheless trusted me with their stories. I suppose the longest span of my ongoing conversion has come in the form of sitting and listening to the pain of the marginalized. And in regards to racism, the pain of Black brothers and sisters who helped me see the water in which I swim. There was the partnership that formed between Los Angeles's St. Paul's Presbyterian, a largely Black church, at Brentwood Presbyterian, a largely white church, in the wake of the acquittal of 4 white police officers who had savagely beat Rodney King. The partnership met monthly, seeking to build a bridge between our communities. And I loved this amazing group of women and men. We talked honestly and openly. We laughed and cried. We shared burdens. We prayed for one another across the peaks and valleys of life. You may well recall October 2nd, 1995. The verdict in the O.J. Simpson trial was handed down that day. The glove didn't fit. O.J. was acquitted. The white community was incredulous, the Black community triumphant, and I was bewildered. At our next partnership meeting, we walked together on holy ground. We asked our St. Paul's members to help us understand, and their sacred stories began to pour out. The long legacy of LA police brutality toward the African-American community was unknown to me, but a daily reality for our partners. Stories of beatings, of relatives gunned down, of being followed and harassed simply because of the color of their skin. My ignorance was on full display. I had no idea that being stopped simply for driving or shopping while Black was a universal urban reality. The jubilation over O.J.'s acquittal was pent-up anger at being treated for a lifetime as less than, as guilty until proven innocent, as expendable. Our partnership went to a new level that night and all of the nights that would follow as we walked together through sacred, painful territory. Time does not permit me to share many of the other important stories that I was privileged to share over these last years. But I would like to say a few words about the Reverend Mark Jones. Many of you know him. Mark was on my staff at Westwood Presbyterian Church, and we had many opportunities to sit and share our lives. Did I tell you about the time? He'd ask. And along with the hilarious and lovely stories woven over a lifetime, out would flow accounts of beatings, of being shot at, followed, pulled over for no good reason, run out of town, robbed, refused service, redlined out of a home, spat at, swore at, passed over. 7 decades of living while Black in the land of the free and the home of the brave, the most Christian nation on earth. Mark's stories were painful to hear, each indignity seeming worse than the last. Often I was incredulous, his world and experiences so different from my own. Regularly, I would apologize on behalf of the church and our nation. I'm so sorry you experienced that, Mark. It's just so wrong. Mark always refused my apology. It wasn't you who did it, but I knew differently. I was still somehow complicit. Which brings me to today, to here, to the Grove. It was May 25th, 2020, the brutal murder of George Floyd. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, the whole world watched Officer Derek Chauvin literally crush the life out of another human being, another child of God. And that moment lit a spark in me. How can this be happening in 2020? I felt a deep conviction to do something more. Listening, having my heart broken over and over again was not enough. For me, it was time to get educated, to better see and understand the water in which I swim. That led to a Black Lives Matter book group that spent its first year reading and reflecting on some of the classics on racism and white nationalism in America. We were gifted with Eleanor, an amazing Black woman with the grace and courage to walk with 8 white women who were as ignorant as we could possibly be about Black history and the challenges of living while Black. Owning our ignorance, our complicity, the privilege we enjoy simply because of the amount of melanin in our skin was painful. The learning curve was steep and still is. I remain a beginner. I will be a recovering racist for the rest of my life. So much to learn, so much to unlearn. The second decision out of the murder of George Floyd for me was a decision to form the diversity task force here. Like it or not, we here at the Grove and our beloved Presbyterian Church, as with all denominations, along with our Board of Pensions, have been buttressing systemic racism since our inception, and that needs to change. Our Black and brown brothers and sisters often serve in under-resourced churches, resulting in smaller pension and Social Security payouts in retirement, making moving here to the Grove nearly impossible. We are bringing to the Monte Vista Grove Board at its March meeting a proposal to start an endowment fund that will assist our racial ethnic pastors in meeting our Monte Vista Grove entrance fee requirements. At the same time, we are trying desperately to break through at the denominational and Board of Pensions level, imploring them to deal with the impacts of systemic racism that have historically treated some pastors as more important than others. We are finding it an uphill battle, but we are tenacious, believing that the Church of Jesus Christ must become the church Jesus intends. For me, this is an integral part of my faith journey. And it all comes from Jesus, from my beloved Bible. In my early years, I could not see it. But now I cannot read the scriptures without seeing a radical inclusion at every turn. Mary, who sang, "He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones and has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and has sent the rich away empty." Jesus, who in that racist and sexist context treated the Samaritan woman, the despised other, with respect. And as you will recall, she was a powerful preacher of the gospel. Jesus, who lifted up a Samaritan as the good guy in a story. Jesus, who dedicated his life to the most vulnerable in society. Jesus, who lambasted the powerful. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is everywhere in the Bible. Peter's vision in Acts 11, in which God says about what we have rejected, don't you dare call unclean what I have called clean. It's all right there. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. It is the call of the gospel of Jesus, who proclaimed, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." It's everywhere. Let me close with the statement on diversity and inclusion that your diversity task force created, and that was adopted by the Monte Vista Grove Board at their November meeting in 2020. Monte Vista Grove Homes strives to live out the Christian value of radical inclusivity, intentionally creating and nurturing a community of welcome that reflects the love of God and the rich diversity of the human family. Friends, we have our work cut out for us. Let it be so. Amen and amen. I think Jim takes over now.
There we are. Oh, thank you, Lynn. That was powerful and moving, deeply moving. So now we have a chance to ask questions. You can write your questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, you can hit the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and then click on the raising your hand.
Oh, not actually.
Or we can all go home early. That's fine too.
I have a question.
Yes, Marilee.
Lynn, can you give us any more details about the plan for an endowment fund?
The details are not yet worked out. We're just asking for permission to initiate that fund, and the details to be worked out as we move forward. What we know, because
Wait a chat, if you click on
we
that. Right here.
hold on here. What we know is that we're struggling to have our, in particular, Board of Pensions be responsive to the need for that assistance with that entry fee. And so what we decided is that we needed to do something here and local, and not simply wait for the Board of Pensions to kind of come to its senses. So the details in terms of how that fund will function, the nature of endowment, we're still working on that. But we want permission to get that fund started, because we recognize that we have assistance for people when they run out of money on the end of their stay here at the Grove, but we have no assistance on the front end, and in particular for those who have served very, very faithfully, but have not been able to build the resources of the equity in a home that they could sell and move in and meet that entrance fee. So we really want to serve those who have served God so faithfully. but are kind of stuck, unable to join us.
We have some questions in the chat. First, I want to start with Dale Bruner. You have your hand up.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead and unmute yourself.
All right, can you unmute
It's
me?
unmuted.
Am I
You're
unmuted?
unmuted. You're on, Dale.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Dale.
Oh, that was superb, Lynn, what you shared. And Young Life Leadership is asking me next week to please help them on the question of sexuality,
LGBT.
the LGBTQ question. And I would like your counsel on what you think. How should we advise Young Life leaders who work with all kinds of kids to handle the sexuality question? What is your counsel to me so that I'll be thoughtful in my response to the leadership on this issue?
Well, I know you're walking into you're opening a can of a Young Life context. I do understand that, but I think it's most important that we understand that there's not a soul alive that is not created in the image of God, and that we owe all people the honor and respect due to the God, that the image of God within them. I think we tend to imagine that somehow our sexuality is a choice. And I have yet to encounter anyone in the LGBTQ community who did not know to the core of their being, and generally at a very early age, that God had made them the way they are. And who are we to say that you are less than, that your life doesn't matter, that you are wrong? The scriptures, I think, are very ambiguous on the matter. And I know that in Young Life, the scriptures would be very important. And there's a lot that's been written that helps lay out what, what a different way, certainly a different way than I was raised, a different way of understanding the LGBTQ place in the world. So I'd love to talk more with you about that. And I think there are some resources that would be very helpful. But for me, it is, we're part of this human race, this amazing, beautiful human race that God has created. And we do not get to say who matters and who doesn't. And that's God's job. Our work is to love and to embrace and to help people become fully who God has created them to be. And this is like a weekend conference question, so that we could talk about that for quite some time. But bless you as you do that hard work.
Great. Another question, Lynn. What did you read in the Black Lives Matter book group? Any highlights?
Yes, a lot of many highlights. Actually, I think the one that was probably, well, a couple, the one that was the most profound and impactful for me was Ibram Kennedy's How to Be an Anti-Racist. He's the one that actually helped me understand that we don't get to be passive on this matter. If we're passive, it means we are a racist. It doesn't mean we hate Black people, brown people. What it means is that we're not really working to make the world the world that we want and intend, and that our goal, our hope, is to be active in doing all we can to change the systemic racism, the policies that keep people oppressed and out and feeling that sense of marginalization and being discounted. So I'd start with that one. It's thick. You kind of have to pick it up and put it down, but it's well worth reading. I think Caste is another great one. If you want just a kind of story, I would say The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, who also wrote Caste, is a really good one. Who wrote White Fragility? Remind me, it's not coming to my head, is another. I could put together a resource if people were wanting more resources that were at least the ones that were helpful to me. There's just a lot of writing out there right now that I think it is such a moment in time that I trust we can capture and learn from and move in some different ways moving forward. I do think ultimately the arc bends toward justice, and this is a moment where we can kind of do our best. It's such a ripe moment to do our work to bend it that direction as well, with God's help.
Lynn, we have a question here that will tie in nicely with the Diversity Task Force. How can MVGH residents engage in listening to other races?
A great question, and a couple of things. First, I want to say that our goal, won't it be wonderful when we are a more diverse community? So that's one thing that's important for us to be thinking about. Who do you know that might be someone who could come and join us at the Grove where we could have these conversations? The second part is coming up in these two conversations coming up on the 4th and the 18th. I'm hoping we do have, we have one Black resident. I'm so grateful that Catherine Hughes, she blesses me every day, every time I encounter her. But we do have some Asian Americans. We're not completely white. And so I'm hoping that all of us will engage in these conversations. And again, the conversations are not to sort of give opinions. They're about telling our story so that we can understand the water in which we swim. And as we understand that will then hopefully compel us to change the nature and texture of that water so that everyone can swim in it freely. So I'm hoping, and again, there are people that live outside of Monte Vista Grove. In your church, surely that there are, go on Facebook. Who do you know on Facebook? And ask to have lunch. There are, be assertive in saying, you know what, I'm a beginner here. I need to learn. I need to be in conversation with someone who experiences life differently than I do. I just think we have to do it. We just have to be in relationship.
Right.
Excuse me, Lynn. I'm a Black American, and I volunteer at the Grove and the thrift store with Beverly Grant and others. And you touched me. You really touched me. I cried. But you know what truly God wants us to be. So don't give that up. And yes, people will be people. But when you have the love that you showed me tonight, and you can move others, I pray for that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I really believe that if we can have these kinds of open conversations, and I hope that I think Catherine would be fine with my sharing this. Catherine Hughes has said that she has numbers of clergy colleagues who wonder why she's here and kind of assume that this is a place where there wouldn't be a welcome if you are Black. And that's a knife through the heart. And I want us, you came up on the screen, your name says Verar, V-E-R-A-R. I don't know if that's your name, Verar. I don't know what your name is.
Vera.
Okay, Vera R. Okay, Vera R. But thank you for that. And I think that, it is, we simply must find a way to be who we're called to be and to share our stories and to love one another, no matter what, no exceptions. So thank you, Vera. And I'm glad that you're a part of our community.
Cecil Hoffman has his hand up. Cecil, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, Lynn, I want to thank you for what you've done today and for the life opening that you've experienced, heart opening that you've experienced, and the sustained, really focused effort that you've made to educate yourself and to help educate others. So you're such a gift, and thank you very much.
Well, I had good model neighbors in who I share our wall mates, Cecil and Pat, who have shown me the way, shown us the way. So thank you.
We have a comment in the chat and somewhat of a question. My son this is Nancy Mackey. My son in a St. Louis church arranged for monthly meetings with a Black church to meet monthly just to talk and listen to each other. Could Monte Vista Grove do this?
Absolutely. That was the basis of the partnership that we had in between Brentwood and St. Paul's. And, you know, it was a precious gift. And so that may certainly be something that we could explore. So pass that along to your diversity task force or your resident executive council.
Anyone else want to unmute and ask a question or make a comment?
Yes. Yes.
This
Bruce.
is Bruce.
Yes. Lynn, this was powerful and it was informative. And it was so personal. But you wound up with some practical ideas on what to do from the diversity task force. And I'm hoping that the fund is established, maybe the board would be interested in a matching fund kind of relationship on something. But what I also deeply hope, and I was going to email this to you, but this is probably better. I just desperately hope that when that fund is established, that it will be not only a designated fund, but that will not be labeled endowment in such a way that it is, we sometimes use the word endowment when you can't spend the money, you can only spend the earnings from that money, which would mean it would take decades to even begin to get a reasonable amount of help for that purpose. So make it as a designated fund, but one where the immediate gift can be used as needed.
I think that's what we're thinking, and probably the sense of the name endowment might not be the right word. Again, we haven't really drilled down on what that will be. But I think in our heart of hearts, what we want is one, perhaps 2 new racial ethnic residents annually. And to do that, that's a fair chunk of change when it comes to the assistance that may or may not all racial ethnic clergy are in need. I think part of it, we need to break down this perception that we're for whites only, and we have to, you know, be reaching out to those that we know. But it is a fair chunk of change when you're looking at the kinds of entrance fees that it now takes to allow the Grove to be viable over the long haul. That entry fee is really important. So we need to figure out ways where we can kind of contribute to that for those who cannot afford it. So 1 to 2 a year, 1 to 2 new racial ethnic households per year, that would change, you know, make the next 5 years, we would be a different community. And that would be really, really exciting. Then that's our hope.
Indeed.
So get out your checkbooks, everyone.
So Lynn, we have a couple people who've unmuted themselves, but before they do, we have a great suggestion in the chat from Judy and Larry Ballinger. I wonder if there's a primarily Black senior community in North Altadena or South LA, or somewhere we could partner with for discussion together, people our age and stage. I love that.
I love that. And that's why we do these musings. So this is why we do the conversations that are happening next 2 Fridays. Please sign up. There's a sign up in Marwick.
So I have Barbara Dosker, who's unmuted herself first, and then Karen Burns. And go ahead, Barbara.
And the question of relationship with your father, as you became an adult, did you seek to influence your father in any way to make a change in his thinking?
You know, my experience has been that fundamentalists don't change their thinking very easily. And my father and I had very little connection. We could talk about the Denver Broncos and the weather, and that was about it. And you know, he didn't believe I should be a minister. So we, you know, that was never fixed. So it wasn't like we could have conversations about things about which we were so divergent. So no, I did not try. I tried to live my life and live out my call as best and as faithfully as I could. And I trust that he's in heaven now and has it figured out. So, but that did not happen on this side of his story, no.
Great. Karen Burns.
Yes, well, I hear us talking about Black and persons of color clergy, but I really want to encourage us to remember how enriched we are by those elders who have moved here, ruling elders who have moved here, and not overlook or put a class system down on African-American and other ruling elders of color. And so let's make sure that we are encouraging this designated fund to include them also.
Thank you for that good reminder. And actually, if I would love if we had a Black elder, a racial ethnic elder from, if you have people you want to encourage that could help us become a more diverse community, that would be wonderful. Our Board of Pensions is pretty limiting. That's, you know, we can get a little stuck around the limits that they put on entry here, but absolutely, thank you for that.
I have, and I will continue.
Please do. And I can get, well, we can get them tours and applications, and we would love to have them.
Other questions or comments? Jim, I think we're at the top of the hour and
We are.
Nancy Moore had her hand up.
Moore had a
Oh.
question.
Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yes. So we are at the end of the hour, and Lynn, I really like the title you chose. Confessions of a Recovering Racist. And I think we could all do that. We could all sit down and write it out or say it to ourselves. But look at how we have changed, or maybe not changed, over the years as we find ourselves in different settings, different contexts. And I think we don't do that enough. You mentioned your dad. It's so hard for him to change because of a rigid set of thoughts, ideas that kept him in the same place. We're not at that place. We can change. We can all change, and we need to do our own recovering of a confession of a recovering racist. So the small groups are going to do that, and again, I'll join Lynn in encouraging everyone to join those two groups that will be meeting the next couple of weeks. So again, thank you for a very thoughtful, challenging, and something that caused us all to think about ourselves. We'll have a next Musings in October. I don't know who that's going to be. So if anybody has an idea, let me know. Thank you, Lynn. We appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here.